Recently I got back into reading. I realized that when I was a kid, I used to read a lot, and I had, put it aside for a minute, and I didn't realize how big of a place it had in my life. I noticed that in a lot of cases, books can be a huge part of learning many skills and many parts of understanding society and ourselves and other people. Um, and it can help tremendously in a lot of cases, such as becoming more attractive, and that can apply to relationships, it can apply to business, it can apply to sales, it can apply to everything around the world. And see here, for example, there are a few books that I started to read. I mean, that I read this year, right? Most of these books are actually books about storytelling. Like most of these ones are stories, sci-fi, not really sci-fi, but police books. And what I've noticed is that my liking for these is mainly because they involve a lot of people. They mainly involve realistic scenarios where people communicate with each other. And this is what I like to pass on to you today. Is this idea that basically to read books that are storytelling, maybe not necessarily fantasy, but you can as well. But a lot of those where they're police books and books that have a lot of, you know, human understanding and human communication in them on a ground level, right? On a grounded level can allow us to better understand how does the world work around us outside of ourselves without having to actually struggle to find a way to be a part of it. It is right here, you know. For example, this is the latest book that I'm reading, and what I could say is that there are many things you can learn from them, and I made a list today that I wanted to go over them with you. The first one is the idea of storytelling, is the idea of how things sequence each other right after the other. And so you see characters taking actions. And what is fascinating is that the authors here put together a story. And so, in a way, what they are saying is that for them, this is the natural progression of things. This action is okay after this action, or this action is not okay after this action, right? And that can apply to many, many things. Men and women relationship, cordial relationships or more formal ones, and what is considered to be disrespectful, respectful, what is supposed to be, um, you know, um, actions that are more seen as a threat, whereas actions that are more clear, which ones do you question, which ones do you not? And you see the characters go through it, and in a way, you get to observe the mental trail that they go through without having to actually ask somebody about it, because the point of view from which these books are written is usually from an omnipresent point of view. That means that it is you're like everywhere and nowhere at the same time, so you get to hear the thoughts of the actors, the characters. You get to be in the mind with them as they make the actions. And so there's tremendous value as far as social skills in consuming books like this, right? The next one is vocabulary, right? You don't want to be that person that always repeats the same two words that they have to talk about something. There is sort of a benefit to talking in a way where you can you know reach a bigger audience by speaking with words that are basic, right? Like they say, write or speak in a fifth grade level, because most people have that level of um, you know reading, and that's all good and stuff. But what I've noticed, at least in conversations that are more deep, or where you really want to be understood by the other person, right? As soon as they become a bit more important to you, you're gonna want to be understood, and that's when having the right vocabulary can make a big difference. Just like um, just like in painting, where having the certain shade that you're looking for can be really important in some points because it's really detailed at that point. The next point is the communication skills, right? the communication skills that you can understand by seeing the dialogues that people go through. You get to basically observe all of these conversations. Not only that, but also see how do people react to them, right? If you take any part of a book which has a dialogue, you'll get to see, for example, she's psyched. She's psyched. So somebody exhales really loud, right? Um, After they hear a news, that means it's a negative one, or it was really stressful to this person to hear, right? You can see like small hints of things that you wouldn't be able to understand if you were just to see them in life. But here you get to have a sort of confirmation about suspicions that you might have about the human way of communicating without necessarily necessarily talking, right? Which brings us to my next point. Not only does it help us develop bigger communication skills, right? It also allows us to learn a lot about human nature. You get to actually see the good and the bad, and how do people use actions, words, and a vast other area of, depending on the situation, to act. How do people act? How do people what is the logic that people use, whether for good or for bad? Which one do we use to judge what is a way that people express themselves that we consider to be harmful versus positive, right? What is a way that which people act that we consider to be out of line or in line, right? What do we use to basically understand that? And based on the fact that the whole representation of the scenario and the actions are by words, you get to really have a sort of a you get to really have an understanding which will be it's counterintuitive, but by the fact that it's written, you get an even clearer idea, because this whole book was written by the same person, right? Technically. And so there's a continuation in the ideas, right? And the fact that you get to go through the whole the whole thing with a continuum in the logic gives you an even deeper sense of understanding, and allows you to broaden your understanding of the social life, just life as a whole. You don't have to necessarily agree with the actions that the characters take. You don't have to agree with the things that they do, but you get to, in a way, understand not necessarily them, but understand how do we judge, or what is an appropriate way to go about judging those thing, or assessing them is a better word, right? And so, yeah, this is the next part, is maybe it touches a bit on the point we touched earlier, but it's the unspoken understanding, right? For example, in many cases in books, people will talk on the phone, and at some point they don't really say bye, but they hang up, right? And I remember as a kid, I used to really find that odd. But you get to learn that in life, those things are not, in a lot of cases, that's natural. Comes a point in conversation where people both understand the conversation to be done, and then they hang up. And I think for these first points, we could already talk about how that can have a tremendous influence on how you could, present yourself in a way that is a lot more attractive to other people. It is a lot more attractive to talk to somebody who can say what they want to say the way that they want to say it, and that can be through an unspoken manner, as using the words that they want to use the precise words that they want to use, because the same way that you read the book and it has only one author and you get to have a continuum, people will also read what you present to them the same way that you are reading this book, and there's going to be one continuum. And so your skills in expressing yourself, whether that is through the words or through the actions, will be just as important as the way that The author has to. You understand what I'm trying to say? And this idea of the unspoken understanding is huge in social life. It's huge to be able to understand, basically, for example, in dating, right? For example, in somebody showing interest to you, somebody showing you signs to approach them, right? You got to be able to read a room. You got to be able to know when your presence is not welcome, or when it is you're overstepping boundaries, or maybe the person you're talking to is with somebody and you realize they are together romantically involved, or something like that, and maybe it is your time to step away. See, all of those skills require either experience or exposure. And exposure is what you can get from the books, pretty much, because this amount of experience is going to be hard for you to get, mainly at an early age. And you could see how much that could build confidence in somebody, to have been exposed to all of these different methods of thinking. And now you have groundwork that you can see as you step into the world. You have at least a few points, and you can say, mentally, basically, you have these references, right? And the references are not the books themselves, but these ways of thinking. And somewhere between all these references, there'll be you, that will have formed as a product of processing all of this information, processing all of these ways of viewing life. And but before we keep going, I'll just finish the list that I have here, because this was mainly about the social aspects. But one of the points that I want to touch on is one particular book, because I hadn't reading this book before, and I learned that it was more popular than I thought. But 1984, for example, from George Orwell, allowed me to understand that books can also serve as a way to get a better understanding of the world that we live in, not necessarily only on the social side, but the bigger, right? The bigger level to it, which is the political side. And that can be beneficial too to the subject that we're talking to, as far as reading the room, right? On a bigger scale. To read the room, to understand, for example, the content that you see on social media, to understand what people refer to when they're talking about this or that or the other. And you'll realize also that a lot of books are points of reference for a lot of things that people talk about. And it is almost expected when you get to certain levels, certain rooms, to have a certain level of general knowledge. And that will essentially mean a certain level of research in certain facts, to have read certain books, to be familiar with some documents or some movies, right? So yeah, movies can also work to a certain extent, right? Not to the same depth, but they sort of are part of this as well. The next point is power rules. There's, the famous book that everybody knows, The 48 Laws of Power, right, by Robert Greene. But it's as much as like that book, right? Well, I haven't read it, but like by the way people talk about it, I haven't read it yet. But it lists, right, the 48 laws. But to see them in action, right? To see them in action in books gives you a profound understanding of a lot of the power rules that expose themselves in conversations, in many social settings, right? It could be at a coffee shop. It could be in on text. It could be when somebody writes to you or you write to them, and when people laugh, or for example, if they're laughing at you or against you, when somebody's trying to say something which is, slick. All of that stuff is small little. It becomes really, how do you say? Becomes really detailed work, and that level of detail, right, for you to be able to maneuver in that space will require you the skills to do so, and the understanding to do so. And that's where books are beneficial for that, because they expose you to it in context that you'll absorb and understand quite quickly. The next one is deep, because when you find yourself in social settings where you find yourself in um, creating bonds with people and creating relationships, basically whether professional or intimate ones, there's going to come um, uh, sort of a there's a progression to these things, and the way in which intimacy is formed, right? And how that intimacy will formed based on the nature of your relationship with the person is often a subject of these books, right? And a lot of movies, a lot of books, the two characters, for example, there's a male officer, or there's an outlaw, and there's a female officer, and blah blah, and then they work the case together, and then at some point down the line, they end up, hooking up, or sort of, building some type of um, complicity between each other, and all of that is really subtle buildups that happen to the book, right? And these are also beautiful things that happen in life that you can be exposed to, that you might even see, but you won't really understand unless yes, there is a natural um, instincts that can kick in, but to be exposed to them in a way where you can understand the role that those things have, the meaning of that type of bond with someone, and sort of the how special those things are, and all that, everything that it involves, gives you such an advantage on somebody who hasn't, who has no clue that is, what does that mean, how is that built, what did that small thing mean, why did that person treat me different than that person, they treat me a little special, maybe that means that they're interested in me. You see what I mean? You see how deep um, that type of exposure is, and how much of an advantage that is. And the last one is more towards the intimate relationships, but also links with this idea of intimacy. But it's sort of the way in which people express emotions, such as love, but mainly love, right? How is that expressed through actions or through words, in a way which is, um, you know, in a way which is impactful, or within the lines of a certain context, and how those contexts understood. And why is that important is because if you really look around, people use references. Now, we all use references when it comes to all of these things that we just listed and talked about. We already do. That's the thing. But the references that we use are going to be movies, right? Which don't go to this level of preciseness. That don't go to this level of of that won't offer you that clarity that books do, right? Because the point of view in which you you have the detail, and you're involved in the storylines, or it's gonna be music. Those are the two big sources, right? Other than, yeah, sure, real life, but even real life is limited in the times that you had and how you process them. So to be able to not only process, right, but also to express, to give back, and to have that dynamic with the world both ways will require you to have the tools and the awareness. And that's why, to add reading books, not books about, not necessarily books about dating, or, and you can even argue that these are even more impactful by the the list that we just spoke about here, towards bettering um, your skills, bettering your skills in approaching life moving forward. And so, if you're gonna use references anyways, well, they might as well be the best ones, in a way that they are the most authentic the most complete and authentic work that you could expose yourself to understand the world and be part of it more effectively. So that was my whole video. Thank you guys for watching, and if you're up to this point, please give a like, subscribe, let me know what you thought, and leave a comment. I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.